Hey guys, so I really wanted to do a video showing my writing progress because I've been writing for 16 years. I started writing when I was 10 and I'm now 26 years old. And I noticed that people who sing or play instruments post a progress video where they first start off singing or playing and then how they get better over time, and they are willing to own up and face the cringiness and how bad they sounded when they first started versus the progress and where they've come from and where they are now. And I wanted to do the same thing because in 16 years, I was 10 and my writing was really dumb and cringy. And I've learned a lot of things throughout my journey. And I just wanted to use this as a video to encourage other writers, to kind of remind myself of how far I've come, and to kind of document my progress because it'd be interesting to see where I'm going to be in the next 10 years after this, And I originally did a video, but it ended up being 50 minutes long and it was too detailed, so I'm trying again with a new technique this time, and not getting too technical as I was the first time. So we'll see if this works. So I'm going to get really raw and vulnerable with you guys. A lot of this is going to be really cringy and stories that I haven't looked at in years and stories that I never really want to release to the public. And I feel like I need to be open to actually show my progress because everybody had to start somewhere, and that includes writing. And we all had to start from somewhere. So I really hope that you guys enjoy this video and enjoy my honesty and my vulnerability. And I hope that you can just kind of laugh with me as we go along and that this video touches you as much as it's touched me. So let's get right into it. So I'm going to be talking about all of this in different categories, because as a writer, there are different genres and styles of writing that I learned in different phases. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is fight scenes, just because it's one of the most important parts of writing for me because I do a lot of them. Before, when I first started writing when I was 10, most of my stories was stupid little teen stuff where a couple or a group of friends has a problem, God helps them through the problem, and it's a modern contemporary story, as you guys would call it now. And so the only fight scenes, if there were any, was just kind of a fist fight back and forth, and it was really immature. He punched him, he attacked, is basically the gist of what I would do. So at some point, my cousin and I came up with an idea. We wanted to do kind of an alien invasion style book, but I didn't really want to do sci-fi. So we came up with a race. We called them E2s because they shoot electricity out of their fingers, and we thought, hey, the way they have their power, they have 2 extra molecules than humans do, and that's why they're called E2s. So the gist of the story is these characters, the main characters, are running and fighting the E2s. So it had a lot more action scenes in it. And it was the first time that not only I had a fight scene, but that I had a fight scene of people, bad guys, with powers. And this was the precursor to Hunter. So that's what I want to take a look at. These are really cringy fight scenes. In the 4 scenes that I'm going to show you, a lot of what we see here in this first one is where it's really vague. The first line says, suddenly something was thrown at Reese. Well, we don't know what was thrown at Reese, we just know something was, and that's really hard to picture visually. Later on, it's very clunky, he was screaming, he was yelling, that sort of stuff. The electricity itself is not described, and I'm going to get to that more later as we get to the next book after this, Hunter. But in the next part, they jump on top of the car, and we don't know exactly where the E2s are in relevance to the car, so the location is really vague, the descriptions are vague. A lot of times in these scenes you can see that there's a lot of dialogue, so the action and the revelation of what's going on in the scene was revealed through dialogue, which I used because I didn't actually want to write the fight scene. Another part in this next scene, again, there's the huge dialogue. Whenever they climb out of the car, it was nothing specific, it was just he climbed out of the car rather than his hands gripped the edge and he yanked himself over, specific movements. I didn't know how to do that yet. And so this is kind of, as you can see, you can really tell that this is where I started off on. At another part, he stabs an E2, and we don't know where he stabs them or where this random E2 came from because it wasn't really stated, and the E2s themselves are not actually specifically described. As we move on to the fight scene in Hunter, So the next book that I wrote more books than just, I didn't go straight from Invasion to Hunter, mind you. I had other books that I wrote in between there, but the next fantasy style book that had a lot of fight scenes like this that I wrote was Hunter. I don't remember when I wrote Invasion, but it was a long time before I wrote Hunter. And Hunter, I wrote it in 2012, 2013. And I still hadn't done a lot of fight. Like the last fantasy style fight scene I had done was Invasion. So I still didn't have a lot of experience, but in this book, with my husband's help as he was editing with me, because at this time I'd gotten, we were dating, I think at the time, I learned that the characters, the bad guys with powers, this was the first book in Hunter, this was the first book that I learned that you can describe the power itself. Like Gernark, you know, he fought with fire, so in this scene you can clearly see that the fire itself is actually described a lot more times, and we know where it hits people and everything else. And before in Invasion, I didn't actually describe the electricity when I should have, and that's kind of where the growth level came from these two. But in Hunter, the thing that I didn't do is I described the location a lot better than I did in Invasion. But here I just used the word trees a lot, so we know they're kind of in a forest. But if you look in Samurai, in the fight scene here, there is very, very specific dialogue, not dialogue, there's very, very specific description here. You know, there's a cannon blown and it hits the room that she's in, and so the specific rubble is actually described. We can see the room that several pieces of debris fell on her. You know, there's a debris in her right arm, so the character interacts with the environment a lot more, and that makes the environment feel more real because it's there. And so that's the way that I grew from Hunter to Samurai, which was a short time period, probably 2014, 2015-ish. So that was the difference of about a year-ish, and that's how I grew there. But the other thing in Samurai, because a lot of it's a fantasy world, but it's based off of Japanese samurai in the 15 to 1800s. So I did a lot of research in the Japanese samurai culture, and because of that, they had specific fighting styles. I did not want to take the time to research the fighting styles specifically because I was already doing research for a lot of the other culture. So what I did was I kind of guessed at what the style was like, and I took a lot of the techniques that we used in Taekwondo that I was in at the time, and I used that as the fighting styles in the book. But again, the specific research wasn't there, so that's where I kind of lacked, and I grew later. But you can see here that these two characters are sparring. Okay, in this fight scene here, in that movement, she revealed her entire technique to me, whereas mine focused on flowing, continual movements, hers centered around speed and smaller, accurate strikes. So basically, I just listed out kind of what the style was. I didn't get really specific with it, and then I go on to the specific fight scene. In the next one, again, two people sparring. She's really fast. He's really just, you know, single powerful strikes kind of thing. So then, years and years later, when I wrote Immortal in 2016, so this is like 6 years later, 14 to 16. This is 2 years later. I'm really bad at math. So a couple of years later in 2016, when I wrote Immortal, again, a character, Jace, is spending a lot of time in Japan. So with him, I knew I had to look up the specific techniques, what they were called. I learned that sword fighting over there is called kinjutsu, and I specifically list out in this scene, two characters are talking and they're both watching a fight, and the older character is asking Jace, you observe their techniques, what do you see? And so Jace describes the techniques, so that style is still there that I used in Samurai, but the difference is the older character this time responds and says it's called Miyamo Ken. And that fighting style, because these characters that they're watching are actually real people in life that lived in the time period, that was actually their real fighting style. So it makes it realistic. The other character, Hijikata, that you can see they're talking about in this scene, he was actually a self-taught fighter, and he used a mixture of different styles, and so that was brought out as well. And so in Valiant Part 1, this is one of the second to last book in the Valiant series. There's no spoilers, by the way, but there's a fight scene again with Jace, and this time I had the characters fighting together, and they kind of bounced off one another. They, you know, the way his body looks with the guy fighting with Jace. Hold on. His slender lockjaw body enabled him to easily push off Jace's arm without hurting it. So it was really specific descriptions of the characters. In Samurai, the thing that I lacked was specific descriptions of the characters, their body movements, and you know, it was a lot of just my sword sliced here, but in this one, at the end, Jace raises his sword and it specifically describes the angle of the sword. So I learned a lot in those years, and this was my progression of specific fight scenes, like with, you know, one character fighting another or multiple opponents. So the next aspect that I wanted to quickly go over, and I'm going to breeze through this part, was sieges. The first time that I actually did a medieval siege where bad guys are storming a castle was in Samurai, and I had a lot of sieges. I did research about how sieges would go in those times, and I learned to basically that you have to tell readers what's going on in the siege, but that resulted in Samurai in some info dumping. So you have really long paragraphs that's describing the siege ladders and what they're doing, and as you can see in the scene here, you know, they're trying to get the battering ram together, and then this next one, it talks about the ladders and they're getting it up there, and the bad guys are conserving their stuff, and it's good, but it's still just a lot. So in Dark Magi, a couple of years after that, when I started writing Dark Magi, not only was this had magic versus Samurai did not have magic, so this was a magical fantasy siege, but I learned to reveal the information that the readers need to know so they know what's going on in the siege. I learned to reveal that in dialogue, so you can see that Kieran is telling the other Magi, I need you to go here because of this, and I need you guys to go here because of this, and it's a lot less clunky, and it's a lot less, it's not an info dump to the readers because it's dialogue, and the characters are finding this out with the readers, and so that is the technique and how I grew with siege battles between Samurai and Dark Magi. So that's my progression there. So next we're going to look at romance in general. I'm going to talk about romantic subplots in fantasy books, and then I'm going to talk about contemporary ones. So long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I tried to do a fantasy book. I was inspired a lot by The Last Airbender, and my book was not fantasy at all because it didn't have magic. Literally it was just set in another world, and that's really the only reason why it's considered fantasy. It's called Discovering the Beginning. It's really, you're about to see the most cringiest stuff you've ever seen. So ready yourself. Okay, so in this first scene, we have a princess and her maiden talking to each other. A guard comes up and speaks to them, and then the guard walks off. So it's a lot of repetitive. The guard constantly calls her milady all the time. Oh my gosh, he's so cute. I know, I really love his muscles. Yeah, well, being a guard, he probably has to work out a lot. I know, but you know, it's forbidden. That is beyond cringy. And it's just, it's really teenish. You can tell this was written by a middle school level. It's just, it's really cringy. And the same thing happens throughout this book. You have, you know, this other guy asking the girl why she's crying, and the girl's like, there are more important things going on that I can't explain. I like you, I really do, I love you, but we have to end it now. Maybe sometime in the future we can get back together, but not now. And he's like, Sammy, and she's like, please don't make it any harder than it has to be. And I'm just like, I can't look. It's so cringy. And then we have another cringy scene at the end where, I like you, he said. Oh, that's nice. What? I like you. Like you. I don't know. There's too many likes in there, but what? Stop confusing me. I love you, he said. Oh, well, truth is, I like you too. Really? Well, then I guess you're just gonna have to be my girlfriend. That's middle school level. I mean, it's really shallow. I mean, do I even need to tell you guys that this is cringy and shallow for you to know that this is cringy and shallow? So the next book that I had, as you can see, that sucked. I was young. It was middle school. We can pretend like that doesn't exist. But the first book that had a romantic subplot was Hunter. Due to the storyline, there wasn't a lot of room for it. So Shifter was the one where I really got to expand upon it. It was my first time adding in a romance into a fantasy book. Thank goodness I had read a lot by this point, so it massively improved. Unlike the previous one, these characters actually talk and get to know one another. It's not a random scene where I like you too, I love you, okay, let's date, we're woo, you know, it's not like that at all. In this, the characters are talking with each other. They accidentally kiss. They weren't supposed to. And so they're talking and they get really awkward with each other, and they're supposed to be awkward. So it's kind of like an awkward scene, but it's one of those that's meant to be awkward. But it's highly improved because the characters are like talking and they're like adult sounding and not like super middle school stuff, as you can see here. The Crystal Heist, which I wrote last year, in this scene, they're still kind of awkward. There's a lot of flirtation going on. You know, he's like, I probably shouldn't break our home. And she's like, our home? You know, because she was just showing him around, and he kind of blushes. You know, it shows that he's kind of embarrassed a little bit. At one point, she looks away because she doesn't want him to know she's blushing. And instead of like, I don't know, I love the way that she describes him, because she doesn't have to say, like in the first example we had, where she's like, ooh, I love his muscles. We don't need to know that, because in this, she specifically describes like his curly hair and his eyes and how they're different colors. Like, she's noticing all these details. And when you like somebody, you notice more details about them. And I feel like that shows the feelings starting to bloom. And the other difference is in a lot of these scenes in the Crystal Heist, the scenes in this was thrown in throughout the book as you're doing the main plot to the story. The romance was kind of just thrown in there too, so it was sprinkled very well throughout the book. And there's just a lot of like, they get to know one another, they talk very deep about their lives and their past, and so there's something more foundational and solid about that. And you can see how I grew from this teeny type romance where I like you too, okay, that means love, and now let's date, you know, versus you actually have to talk, you have to get to know one another, you get to learn if you're compatible for each other and how you guys mesh together, and it becomes something more real. And I think the characters, as I learned that in my own life, the characters in my books did too. So now we're going to get to contemporary romance. And again, a lot of it is the same progression where I was young, so I didn't understand love. And so it was just that teeny type, pathetic little crush that you have in school versus a real love as you get older and you understand more about what love is. And this one is just like the characters. She calls her boyfriend and, they want to come over and they're like, I love you too, baby. And they have all these cute little pet names, but it's still a very shallow style of thinking. That was in the second book in the Liberty High series that I wrote when I was like 11. And then later on in my middle school career, I wrote a book called Everything. And in this one, it was a little better because in this one, it wasn't so shallow. The characters actually went on a date. They were hanging out at the mall. As you can see here, she was trying on clothes and he was just trying to placate her by, saying, yeah, that looks good. Yeah, that looks good. And she's like, you said everything looks good. They're kind of having some good dynamics. And that's when I started to learn, okay, these characters need dynamics back and forth. And so I actually would give them specific scenes to show that they're falling in love or that they're already in love with each other. And then in the last one, they kind of kiss a little bit and they're joking and they're playing games together. And so we start to get to see the characters having a little bit of fun, as I learned that the characters have to spend time together in order to have that romance there. And then this next book we're going to look at is Volcano, that I wrote this year, which you guys are probably already familiar with. And there's this cute scene that they're walking by the beach at nighttime. So I set the scene, and the dialogue between the characters goes on for pages and pages. And they have this really good dynamic. It's another scene where they're kind of awkward. They don't know that they're in love yet, or they haven't admitted it to each other. And they're just kind of talking, and he's like, can I ask you a question, like hypothetical? And again, it was that specific learning to show rather than tell. That's the key that I started learning as I grew older and became more mature in my writing, because he rubs the back of his neck, hesitating and pausing. That shows embarrassment, and that shows that he's extremely nervous, and we get to feel that with him, and it helps the readers feel that as well. And that's kind of how I grew and learned. And so you can just kind of feel the embarrassment and awkwardness, and then afterwards it shows through his dialogue, like, have you ever thought about, you know, the idea of maybe you and me, I don't know, dating? And it's just kind of the realistic way that he would talk. She kind of blanches at him, and that shows her surprise. And that was the last thing I expected you to say. And he's like, funny idea, it was just a prank. And she's like, a prank, you know, and now her feelings are kind of hurt, but she's surprised. But it gets her to thinking about it. And then in this next scene, you can see that she's thinking about it. And she, you know, it just continues the scene. And it's so much more real and tangible because it's not as shallow. So next we're going to look really quickly, and I'm going to breeze through this one because this is probably the most cringiest out of all of them, but my first attempt at a vampire novel versus my actual vampire novel series. So at this time, a lot of my inspiration came from Twilight, so we don't have to talk about this very much. But there's this long scene, as you can see on the screen, where she's being attacked by vampires. She's freaking out that they're real, and she's going on and on in her head. It's just the most cringiest thing I've ever seen in my life. Where, you know, in the book Twilight, and she's just thinking about this book, and she's being attacked by vampires. It totally doesn't fit. She's thinking about Blade. She's thinking about, you know, does he like me? Does he not like me? And it's like, maybe you should be a little more concerned with the vampires and everything else going on. And then in the next scene, she's kind of talking to him about being a vampire. She's surprised. Again, there's a comparison to Twilight. You know, he's like, where'd you learn all this from? And she's like, there's a book, and she talks about it. And it kind of uses the book Twilight to compare at what she knows versus how vampires actually are. And that's a really lame technique, and it's just really super cringy. But in Bloodless Secrets, I got more original, and this is kind of what I learned here, was go with my own ideas. It doesn't have to be compared to anything because these things in my world does not exist. So in this one, they have specific scenes that they talk together. There is... the characters themselves have several scenes together where they get to know one another. In this one, he's helping her study, and it's completely focused on the studying. There's nothing else included in that, but it gives them a moment to get to know one another, and that makes it more realistic, and it makes the relationship a lot more tangible. So in this next bit, this is an example of her thinking about the possibility of something unreal happening. First of all, it's not just one single moment that reveals to her. There is a reveal moment, but it's just like in this one, something happened that she couldn't explain, and she's trying to rationalize it, and she does end up rationalizing it, but you can see her thoughts, and it just kind of takes her thoughts through the process of what she's thinking and what she's discovering. It's a lot less cringy, and there's no other books compared to it. It's just like a realistic, okay, what would somebody in this circumstance actually think? In this next scene, she actually thinks that he's anorexic because the realism behind this is that he never eats food in front of her. And so she's just like, I think you have a problem. I'm your friend and I'm very concerned for you, but I think you're anorexic. And he just kind of laughs because he's a vampire, but she doesn't know it. And not only does it create this really funny scene, but it actually is a little bit more realistic in the sense that, okay, what would a person actually think if there was a vampire in front of them? And I think it makes it more grounded in that. So we're almost done here, but the next couple of things we're going to look at really quickly. My first attempt at a sci-fi and my first actual sci-fi is really like showcasing the difference in my writing. So the first attempt at a sci-fi is actually one of the Valiant series books called Mortal, but it sucked so bad that I rewrote the whole thing, and I actually changed it from a sci-fi to a fantasy because it just sucked. And at the time, I rewrote this last year in 2019, and at the time I sucked at sci-fi, so I flipped it back to fantasy, rewrote it, and it got way better. And I had to kind of redo a lot of stuff, but the main plot structure stayed the same because the plot didn't suck, it was the execution. So when I re-executed it, it worked. So this original scene is the opening scene. It's supposed to be kind of a speeder race type thing, like in Star Wars. That's where the inspiration was from. He's driving a thing called a Kiate, which is completely dumb. But, you know, it's just, there's no description of where he's driving this or where, like, there's no mention of the technology specifically because I didn't know what I was doing. So we don't know how it works. You don't really need to get into the details of there, but even the tech itself isn't described. I mean, the environment that he's in sci-fi is very important. If you're driving like a vehicle or a space thing, you have to know where you're going and where it's located. And again, it goes back to that other example with the electricity and the fire and how I learned you can describe the specific magic that's coming out of people, make it a character in and of itself as it's in the scene, interacting with your characters or whatever's going on. Just like in this, the tech in the description needs to be described where it's located, the ships, the speeders, the stuff like that. And there was just none of that here. And the tech absolutely completely sucked. And you can see here just more of the just suckiness. Like the guy's not described, where he's located. The specific Kiate, the little speeder thing, is not described at all, so we have no idea what he's sitting on. And so it's kind of just like this gray fog everywhere in your reader's mind because you can't picture anything. And that's where I started off at. And it wasn't until this year that I wrote my first sci-fi called The Mech Soldier. And my husband actually, I do admit, did a lot of the terms for me in editing, but even then my unedited version without his extra terms was still, I had a little bit, my terms were kind of incorrect at a few points, but it was still a lot better than Mortal. So here we have they're very similar scenes because you have a main character sitting inside something that's sci-fi like, and they're doing something with it. But in this scene, he's inside of a mech suit, and the suit itself is described. We know where he's at. He's in the chest cavity. We know how big the chest cavity is. It's 20 foot by 20 foot, I believe. We know that the overall suit itself is over 80 feet tall. It talks about the neuron signals bounced from him to the mech suit and back again, and that as he moved his body, it moved the suit with him. It describes the suit. It talks about the steel it's made from and that it comes from another planet. There's a little bit of history thrown in there. And then in this next scene, it talks about the terrain he's on. So it gets very descriptive in terms of where he's at. It's obviously another planet. And we know where he's at and what's going on. We can clearly picture him. We can picture this suit, and we can picture where the environment is and where the suit's moving. And it's just so much better. And so there was a lot of growth there in learning to describe the scene itself and because I learned to describe the scene itself, and I learned to describe the tech itself, and make it almost its own character, and you get to see the scene so that it can clearly be visualized. So overall, my progress, I started off where the descriptions weren't very specific. There was a lot of vague information. I didn't know to describe specific powers or tech. The relationships were really shallow because I was young, and that's what relationships were to me at the time. But as I grew as a person, I also grew as a writer because I learned relationships have to be found. They have to have a foundation. The characters need to have scenes together. They have to talk. It's not just a random, hey, I like you too, now we're in love thing. It has to be realistic and sprinkled throughout the book if you're doing a subplot of romance. The tech and the sci-fi and the fantasy powers have to be specifically described. I learned to do research, and the more research that you do, the more tangible your world and your characters feel in the book. I grew and I read more books. I learned more mature vocabulary, more mature writing style specifically, so that I wasn't as clipped, I wasn't as wordy actually, where I wasn't, a lot of my earlier stuff was extremely clunky, and it was just like you spend a page trying to describe one thing that I can now do in a sentence, and yet that one sentence can say more than I did in that whole page. And I think that's the key to the maturity that I've grown in these last 16 years as a writer. And right now it leaves me very excited to see where I'm going to go in the next 10 to 16 years as a writer, and what else I'm going to learn. And I hope that if you're watching this, you can be encouraged that no matter what you start off with, everybody starts from somewhere. So if you're writing, if you feel like it sucks, I guarantee you it probably didn't suck as bad as some of the stuff I've shown you today, and I hope that you're encouraged, because you can always grow, you can always improve, and that's part of being a writer, is that even the greats of our industry are still learning and growing and becoming better and improving every single time they put down a word on paper. So thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed this. Please like it, because there was a lot of vulnerability and rawness to this. Be sure to share it with any writers that you think needs this encouragement, and subscribe for more videos, writing videos, and I'll be sharing what I've learned and what I know with you guys to help other writers improve, because that's a passion for me too. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this.